I'm not all-knowing. I make mistakes. Not only that, I'm not always good. I sometimes do evil things. Not only that, I'm not all-powerful. I gotta run around in the shower to get wet. I'm so skinny. All right? When I played basketball, guys would say, man, you got rickets? What's the problem, Cliff? In spite of all of that, this little guy has the ability to trust me, to put his faith, to some extent, in me. Let me give you an example. Now, he couldn't prove to you that when I threw him up, I wasn't going to turn around and talk to him. It would have been possible, all right? But he exercises trust and faith. Now look, it's real simple. If he can trust this boneheaded guy, if he can trust Ricketts to not drop him, it is far easier for you and for me to trust Jesus Christ, who lived this incredible life, taught these amazing teachings, died on a cross, loving and forgiving his enemies, and then rose from the dead. You can trust Christ. It's really an issue of will. It's an issue of spiritual decision to trust in him. Do I have all the answers to all the difficult questions? Obviously not. Nobody does. There's a lot of mystery. I got to live with that mystery in life. But there's more than enough evidence that Christ is reliable. That's why you can trust him.
The earliest stories about the resurrection of Jesus came in the form of stories that he appeared in the forms of visions, the forms of dreams, and so forth. And so actually that story was then taken and put further back into Mark, and then a bodily resurrection story was replaced as the final scene in Mark, and the Mount of Transfiguration took its place from the end to further into the center. So to suggest that somehow that the Gospels have more of an ontological and have more of an objective credibility to them as far as the more what we'd consider like extra and supernatural events that are described in it: virgin birth, angels and shepherds in the field, Star of Bethlehem, Mount of Transfiguration, resurrection from the dead, ascension into heaven, and so forth. There really is not any more credible evidence to believe that based upon anything other than faith, any more than there is evidence to believe on his literature, his sacred lore, based on faith. Regardless of what you say, ultimately Christianity or any other world religion or belief system is an issue of faith and faith only.
Obviously, all of our worldviews involve faith. Obviously, all of our relationships with each other as people, with God, is a faith relationship. That is undisputable. Secondly, 50 to 75 years ago, it was taught on every major university campus in the United States that the Gospels were not written until the 200s, maybe the 300s. It was taught on almost every major American university campus that the resurrection of Christ was something that was tacked on by the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century church to give a flagging religion some punch. Unfortunately, for those teachers, the past 50 to 75 years, we have unearthed so many manuscripts, so close to the date of authorship, so many letters by so many early church fathers, that it is abundantly clear that right from the get-go, as early back as you can go, Jesus was risen from the dead, was preached by the first followers of Jesus Christ. It was not something that was added later. His virgin birth was preached right from the get-go. In the book of Acts, Peter stands up at Pentecost and says, "You guys killed the Christ. God raised him from the dead." There never is a non-supernatural Jesus that is preached by those first century followers of Christ. There never is a dead Jesus that is proclaimed by those first century followers of Christ. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that was written approximately 50, 51, or 52 AD, Paul recites a creed in 1 Corinthians 15. "For what I received," Paul writes, "I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for your sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried according to the Scriptures, and that he was raised from the dead according to the Scriptures. That passage, 1 Corinthians 15, was penned by Paul in 50, 51, 52 AD, and he's referring to a creed that he received from others. Now you're back into the 40s AD. You're within 15 years of the events. So regardless of how far you push it back, the overwhelming evidence is the first followers of Christ never knew a dead Jesus. They preached a risen Lord Jesus whom they had seen with their eyes. And that has been a source of intense embarrassment to every religion department on every campus in the United States that bought into that line of thinking that taught the Gospels were not written until the 200s or 300s. The fact that Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, quotes the Synoptic Gospel in 96 AD. The fact that Clement, Bishop of Rome, quotes all four Gospels, including John, in letters he wrote in 115 AD, smashes that whole school of thought that was taught on every major American university campuses 50 to 75 years ago, that the Gospels weren't written until the 200s or the 300s. How could that be true if the Gospels were quoted in letters written in 96 AD and 115 AD? The evidence is crystal clear. The Gospels were written in the first century, and the Gospels insist Jesus claimed to be God, and the evidence is that Jesus rose from the dead. That's the clear evidence.
I just don't see the connection between free will. I think there's an argument that can be made that free will in and of itself isn't a piece of evidence that points to an indication that there's a God. I'm not saying that there isn't a God.
Right.
I'm just saying that there's...
That's not good evidence.
Right.
Right. I hear you.
I'm saying the argument can be made that, no, it's just because in our evolution, we have come to evolve to the point that we recognize our separation as different people and as an independent being, and we have come to evolve as a society to set up laws to limit that sort of want and desire or whatever, to injure or hurt some other person, and limit our own free will in that sense.
Okay, but my point is, if you say there is no God, and you limit reality to matter and energy, therefore, then all you and I are is matter and energy. Which means there's always a material reason for what I do. The reason that I treat this man, however I treat him, is because there's certain chemical reactions that go off, and that's why I do what I do.
Right, I understand, but I think can't you also say that there is a voluntary, we can voluntarily choose which reaction we want to go on? You don't think we can voluntarily say...
Because then what you're saying is, there's more to me than just matter and energy. There's a me that can judge my chemical reactions. But you see, if you limit reality to matter and energy, there's no me to judge my chemical reactions. All I am is a highly, highly complex chemical reaction.
But I would also argue that we are such that we can distinguish between two things and say, okay, yeah, I know that I have to fire this neuron and shoot acetylcholine onto this muscle fiber to make my arm go this way to do this, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to not perform that chemical reaction. I'm not going to perform this act of being this person because I choose not to do that chemical reaction.
Yeah, but you see, when you say I choose, that I doesn't exist. Rather, you've got another chemical reaction that's more powerful than that chemical reaction to hit the guy. And so the more powerful chemical reaction is why you do whatever it is you do.
Well, I'm saying in evolving to the point, evolving our nervous system to the point that we distinguish separation between beings. We distinguish that my arm, my body, my whatever, me in the sense of just my entity, my shell, whatever.
Yeah, but if there is no God,
me being separate from me.
The shell is all there is. The material, matter is all there is. There's no soul. You don't have a soul if there is no God. You don't have an I that goes beyond the chemical reaction. All you've got is the chemical reaction. That's it.
Right, but just by saying that, it doesn't, in my mind, necessarily say that there's no free will. That there's no.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
That I mean, there's no choice.
That's right. That's where I'm obviously trying to pin you, right? I'm trying to say, you know that your experience of life teaches you that you do have a free will. You know that you're.
I don't argue that point. My point that I argue is that free will being a piece of evidence indicating that there is a God. Isn't it possible just to say that, no, I'm just a being that chooses to eat because I'm hungry?
Fine. So it's an instinct. You eat because it's an instinct. I kick him in the jaw because it's an instinct.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Well,
we just have instincts, man. We don't have a free will.
I'm not saying there's no free will. I'm saying that there is free will, but certain things are instincts.
All right, fine. But my point is, if there is no God, everything is instinct.
No, certain things are higher cerebral processes.
They're still regardless of how high they are, I agree with you, they're complex. It's still matter and energy. It's all it is. There's not a soul that's different from the biochemical reactions. There's the biochemical reactions.
There is no soul, you're right. But there is an individual, a personality, just with matter and energy. Now at death, these are going to the matter is going to lose its organization, and the I, the conscious experience, is just going to disappear. But, I mean, it's just the way it is.
You are willing to take a leap there that I am unwilling to take. Just listen to what you're
Isn't that
saying.
easier than to say that there was a God that makes this?
You are willing to say that I am just matter and energy, but consciousness developed. Something different from matter and energy developed out of matter and energy. If you can buy that one, I find that incredible.
It's another level of
matter and energy. All you have is matter and energy. If there is no God. Now, how are you all of a sudden going to have consciousness springing out of matter and energy? It's illogical. It is totally irrational. I mean, and you should have seen it at MIT. At MIT, they were really working. At MIT, they were saying, "Well, you're right, Cliff. We can't explain it, but we're going to get there, bud. You just wait. We're going to get there sometime, and sometime we're going to be able to explain to you how, just from matter and energy, we can get a conscience and consciousness and a free will." And I said, "No, man. You're never going to be able to do that because you're limiting reality. You're saying, here's reality, matter and energy. We are never going to get a soul, a free will, a personality, this nebulous, non-material thing, if you limit at the start reality to matter and energy. It's impossible."
See, but back in the let's say Middle Ages, they couldn't explain all of matter and all the way that matter and energy interacted. You know, in physics, for instance.
Right.
But now we understand a lot more because we use science. Now, isn't that better than just appealing to this, this God that we don't know exists? That I don't know. That's the easy way out. That's the way that primitive man explained his life, his surroundings. But we're beyond that point.
We're to the point where we have a scientific explanation for everything.
No, we don't. But it keeps getting better and better. But if you stay with
No,
God,
sir.
if you stay with the explanation that religion gives you, you don't get anywhere because it doesn't change. It's not
No.
any question.
No. You better keep science in the area of matter and energy, because that's what science is based on, the repeatability of an experiment. And you better realize that no matter how much good science you do, you're never going to be able to put together a scientific marriage or a scientific friendship, or you're never going to be able to go on a scientific date. And the MIT student who's dating his computer is a sad, sad person. I was at UMass Amherst, and after speaking there the last day, This one student came up to me, worked for the student paper at UMass Amherst. And the guy says to me, Cliff, thanks for making it all so clear about Jesus. I said, well, that's great. If it's clear for you, you must be ready to put your faith in him. He said, no way. I said, why not? He said, because Cliff, I like to drink and fornicate. And so he sat down behind me. I'm just about to start again, and this second guy walks up. And he says to me, Cliff, thanks for making this bit about Jesus make so much sense. It's really clear to me now, like never before. And I said, well, that's wonderful. You must be ready to put your faith in Christ. He says, no way. I said, why? He said, because I like to drink and fornicate. And the guy sitting behind me says, well, Cliff, it sounds like that's a common problem here at UMass Amherst. We all like to drink and fornicate. Yeah, that's right. I'm the same way. And Jesus cramps my style. Therefore, I'm going to run away from him. And then I'll hide behind all sorts of neat intellectual smoke screens. Like, I can't prove he exists. Like, oh, there's some contradictions in the Bible. What they are, I'm not sure, but I know they're in there somewhere because a professor told me they're in there somewhere, so they got to be there. I mean, how many times have I heard that one? Like, oh, come on, man, you can't prove to me that God exists. Well, that's right. And you can't prove to me your mother loves you. You can't prove to me your mother's not just fattening you up to drop arsenic in your tea over Christmas vacation. I mean, come on, man. You don't go around proving things in life. You look for evidence, and the evidence is your mom really does love you. That's why you don't bring your chemistry kit to the Christmas lunch. Instead, you eat the food. Based on evidence, you have faith. That's the way it is with me. Based on evidence, I have faith as well. So, that was a long answer to that question. Yes, sir?
Just out of curiosity, how do you feel in regards to Mormonism and their claim of the second coming of Christ?
You bet.
And if they're right, then in the Bible it claims he's going to come again, but then it would have already happened.
Okay, great point.
I'm just curious.
Right. This gentleman asked a great question. He says, respond please to Mormonism. The reason that's a great question is because it brings up the main issue that I've been trying to bang away on. I can't see God, you can't see God. I've never heard God's voice audibly, you've never heard his voice audibly. So in order for you and me to get to know God, God's going to have to open up and reveal what God is like. That's where Muhammad, the avatars of Hinduism, Joseph Smith step into the picture. They all claim to be revealing God accurately. Now, I'm sorry. If anybody says to me, I got a pipeline to God, I'm going to be skeptical. But I'm not going to be a cynic and just wipe them out. I'm going to say, okay, fine. Give me evidence that you're a reliable source of information about God. And obviously what the Mormons have done is they've said Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and the prophets that follow them are reliable sources of information about God. Obviously the Hindus have said the avatars are reliable sources of information about God. Obviously a Muslim is saying, I trust Muhammad to reveal God accurately. And I'm standing out here saying, I trust Jesus Christ to reveal God accurately. And because Jesus and Joseph Smith contradict each other, they both can't be right. So therefore, I got to ask myself, what's the evidence to support the credibility of Joseph Smith? What's the evidence to support the credibility of Jesus Christ? And my point is, based on Jesus' lifestyle, he lived a sinless life. Based on his ethical teachings, which have the ring of truth, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Based on his death on a cross, where at a moment of physically excruciating pain, instead of cursing his enemies the way I would, he prays, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But most importantly, based on his resurrection from the dead, for me, it becomes a no-brainer. The evidence is this Jesus is reliable in a way that Joseph Smith, Brigham Young are not. Therefore, I'll follow Jesus, not Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. See, but that's the bottom line question. Who are you going to trust to tell you the truth about God? Yes.
Being that Jesus lived such a long time ago and Joseph Smith, relative to that very short amount of time, don't you think that, say, we gave it 2,000 years, the Mormons could manipulate and doctor their annex to the Bible in order, as perhaps hypothetically it has been done? Maybe Jesus didn't live such a perfect life, and it has been changed and edited. Don't you think that could evolve and then in the same sort of way? That's what
it's impossible.
That's what I fear.
Right.
That it's propaganda.
Right. I'll tell you why it's impossible. The Gospels that we have in English today are not based on the Latin Vulgate out of the Middle Ages. Rather, the Gospels that we have today are based on over 5,200 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript dated from the 1st to the 10th century A.D., all agreeing to an infinitesimal degree. And you can push the study of Jesus back into the 1st century, and you never come up against a non-supernatural Jesus. You never come up against a Jesus who didn't rise from the dead. You pushed it back in your historical record, and you've got a supernatural Jesus, God in human form. You've got a bodily resurrection from the dead, and you've got this incredible life, a sinless life, right from the inception. So the record is real clear. And we have the record of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. And we have the very clear record that they taught that dark skin is a result of being cursed by God. You compare that type of racism to what Jesus taught in Luke chapter 10, where he makes a direct frontal attack on racism, and you got a fundamental contradiction between the two. You go right back to the Mormon records, and you've got polygamy right there with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. You read the New Testament, and there's no way you can justify polygamy. Now, my point being, Brigham Young and Joseph Smith claimed to be followers of Jesus. If they'd have never made that claim, I wouldn't have my point that I'm making right now. But in light of the fact that they claim to be followers of Jesus, and yet so clearly contradict him, we've got an historical problem. Thank you, sir, for raising those thoughtful issues. I appreciate it a lot.
If he was God incarnate and God knows no sin, then how? I mean, we all function through the mind, and he obviously had a mind. How can he register sin if he knows no sin?
Okay, good question. If he was really God in human form, then how could he sin? Very simple. As God in human form, he chose to limit himself. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is asked, when is your second coming going to be? And Jesus says very clearly, no one knows the day or hour of my return, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So obviously what Jesus is claiming is, he is God in human form, but he's God accepting incredible limitations. And so, as God limiting himself and becoming a human being, he was really tempted by Satan. We read about that in Matthew chapter 4. In the wilderness, Jesus was tempted by Satan. But Jesus repeatedly said no to Satan's temptation and repeatedly said yes to his Father's will. He was tempted in every way, just as we are, the author of Hebrews writes in the book of Hebrews. He was really tempted, but he consistently chose to say no to temptation and to say yes to his Father's will. That's one of the reasons I respect him so much. I have tried to say yes to God's will, and I have repeatedly blown it.
I just don't know if God would limit himself like that. I mean.
Okay, good question. You say, I just don't know if God would limit himself like that. Okay, good point. I understand your thinking. My point is, God does limit himself. And that's a key point for me, especially when it comes to the problem of evil. Professor at Northwestern University in Chicago steps out of the crowd and says, I can prove to you that your God doesn't exist. I said, really? Show me. He said, it's real simple. You believe that God is all-powerful. You believe that he's loving. Evil exists. Well, if evil exists, he can't be all-powerful and all-loving. It's impossible. And I said, sir, there's one possibility you've overlooked, and that's the possibility that the all-powerful God chooses to partially limit his power by creating human beings with a free will. The Allies, a few years ago, could have stormed straight into Baghdad, and they could have leveled Baghdad. The Allies had the power to. The Allies chose to limit their power and stop and not storm Baghdad. When you've got power, you can choose to limit it. That doesn't mean you lose your power. It means you choose to limit it. And my argument is, God can choose to limit his power by creating me free. Which is why, if I go up and slap her in the face, and I say to you, God made me do it because God's all-powerful, I'm lying through my teeth to you. God chose to limit his power by giving me a free will, and God will hold me responsible for striking her in the face. Because he gave me a free will.
How free is his will if he knows what's going to happen?
Great question. And a lot of students say to me, and I'll never forget this, one student at UCLA said, listen, man, none of us have free will, because we can't do anything we want to. I say, wait a second, you are really getting confused here. To have free will does not mean that I can do anything I want and escape the consequences of my decision. You have free will. You can party here at the University of Texas, and then you will flunk. And to say, wait a second, because I flunk, it means I don't have free will, is bogus thinking. To have free will does not mean, hey, I get to escape the consequences of my decisions. No way. If you want to have sex with anything that walks, and you get HIV, that doesn't change the fact you've got free will. What it means is you have sex with someone who's got HIV, and you probably will get HIV. You still have a free will, but there are consequences to your decisions. Well, that's exactly what Jesus taught. You and I have free will, but by gollies, there are consequences to our decisions. That's the kind of world God set up. Cause and effect. You got a free will, make your decisions, but I can promise you there will be consequences to your decisions, Jesus says. And watch out, Jesus says, the ultimate decision that you and I have to make as human beings is, do we want to spend eternity together with God in heaven or eternity separate from God in hell? We're free to decide, but we're not free to escape the consequences of our decision. If we choose to reject Christ, then the consequence will be eternity separate from Christ. That'll be hell. If we choose to live together with Christ, there will be a consequence. We'll spend eternity together with him in heaven. We're free, but we're not free to escape the consequences. You're free to walk to the top of the building and jump. You're not free to escape the consequence. You'll splatter all over the pavement. That's the kind of world that we live in. Free will, but consequences to our free decisions.
How free is Jesus' choice if he never knew sin? If he never actually sinned, then he would never know what a sin is.
Okay, great point. Your point is, wait a second. If Jesus never sinned, then he never really knew what evil was. So he really didn't have free will.
Yeah, he didn't have a choice to sin because he didn't know sin.
Good, he didn't have a choice because he didn't know sin. Real simple, sir.
It's like he's I don't want to say a robot, but if he's telling to be Christ-like and he never knew sin, he never had the choice to sin if
right.
he never knew.
That's a great point. All right, here's my response to you. I have never once raped a woman. That does not mean that I am not in a position to know that rape is wrong. I have never once murdered a human being. That does not mean that I'm in a position to not understand that murder is wrong. And I never once have brought a whip down on the back of a slave. That does not mean that I'm in a position not to know that slavery is wrong. Because I have a conscience and a rational mind, I am able to look at evil and call it evil even though I've not experienced it. Same with Jesus. You're right, Jesus never sinned, but he had a rational mind, he had a conscience, and he could look at evil and say, that's evil, I'm not going to do it. You don't have to experience evil in order to know that it's evil. You can exercise your conscience and your rational mind and say, that is evil, I refuse to do it. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, but if it's in his thought, evil in thought is, if he can rationalize evil, that's evil.
Okay, good. Your point is, wait a second, if I can think about evil, then that's evil. No.
Well, no, he can comprehend evil. God cannot comprehend. If you say that God is, maybe that is limiting. I'm a little confused on this limiting factor because
it's a difficult issue. You're right. The whole idea of God limiting himself, that's a difficult issue. I agree. See, my point, though, is if God is all-powerful, then obviously he can do whatever he wants to do, up to some extent. He can't violate his character. If his character is holy, he's not going to do that which is evil. But if he's all-powerful, he can choose to limit his power by creating us free. That's not irrational. That's not inconsistent.